excuse my format. Traditionally, I've been doing, a bit different, a little bit more professionally looking, but we've kind of got a lot of shit to talk about. In this video, I want to discuss a transcription from an interview with Condal and George R. Martin about House of the Dragon. I want to talk a little bit about the Winds of Winter, and also want to talk about another interview with George R. Martin, where he kind of talks about somewhat of a rivalry between the Rings of Power and House of the Dragon. Before we do any of that, please do me a massive favor, and special thank you to these individuals right here, because they are really the reason why these videos are possible. Basically, YouTube will delist my videos and only put it in their algorithm for a few hours, and then it disappears. In order for a video to be successful on YouTube, it has to be in their algorithm for at least 24 hours, so that way it gets the most amount of views possible. But that doesn't happen, and instead of getting mad, I just decided to push my Patreon. So if you enjoy my content, only if you enjoy it, and only if you can, please consider checking out my Patreon over on patreon.com/SirHuntsReviews. It's just a way of directly combating YouTube's algorithm and delisting my videos. Lonatens autrizas postari, Hixos daor. Now, the actual interview with George and Ryan is released on Audible. And you have to have, not just a regular Audible account, because I have one of those, but you have to have, a pro one. You kind of have to pay extra money to listen to this 30-minute interview. Now, I've found a transcription of that online, and I'm basically going to talk about 3 or 4 of the most important talking points, right? And just kind of add in my own thoughts and commentary along the way. So, to start out with, George R. Martin is asked if he works on House of the Dragon TV show with Ryan. George's response is, well, I think it depends on how you define work on, in quotations. We did have considerable conversations at the beginning. I have not written any scripts for this show, in a way, because Condal kind of contradicts this later on by mentioning that every single draft or note that he would make to sort of take artistic freedom in, he ran it by George first. So George kind of, in a way, wrote this because he wrote the source material. But anyway, I have not written any scripts for this show. When we began Game of Thrones, I wrote a script this season for the first 4 seasons. But then I just got too busy with other things, and the show was diverging anyway. And I have this novel, which still isn't finished. Yes, we know it's been 11 years, buddy. People remind me on a daily basis, so I stopped writing the scripts. And you know what, George? That's kind of like if you keep asking, I'm going to keep making it further kind of thing, kind of treating us like children, because we actually loved it when you wrote the scripts for Game of Thrones. In my opinion, when you wrote the scripts for the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, it showed. Those were the best episodes of the series. You should have kept doing that. Maybe we wouldn't be so mad about not having Winds of Winter, buddy. I'm just kidding. So then Condal goes on and says, George is very busy. In response to that, if he works on House of the Dragon. George R. Martin said, it's hard. I need to clone myself. Indeed, George, you do. All right, so another talking point that George mentioned is, and this was asked by Idris Elba and his wife, and they said, you decided to take a story. Idris Elba specifically said this. You decided to take a story that someone in the show tells a story of, and that's the beginning? That becomes the beginning of this series? Ryan Condal says simply, yes. And then Idris' response to that was, that doesn't complicate things in any way. And George R. Martin was, so that's like the history of the United States, or the history of England. Where do you start? If you're writing the history of England, do you start with the Picts, the Celts, the Romans invading? No, I'll skip them and start with the Saxons invading. Or no, I'll skip them. I'm going to start with William the Conqueror. We face the same issues here. And indeed, that's a major issue with me and some of the other writers who had preceded Ryan on this project. We could not agree on exactly where to begin the story. Now, that's kind of funny if you ask me. There's actual writers that George is working with, and George is getting into arguments with these writers who didn't write his world about where to start the story at. How about y'all go fuck yourselves, whoever those writers were? I think George knows where to start his story because he kind of created this whole thing. But then George goes on to say, they usually wanted to begin earlier and other people wanted to begin later. But I think we found a great place to begin this story. To be honest, when you hear about the Dance of the Dragons, in my opinion, when you read about it, this is like, how could this not make for great TV? It's got a guideline. It tells you exactly where to start and exactly where to finish. And for the most part, you can kind of take your own way to get to the end. while still playing with the rules and keeping it fresh and exciting for people who have studied this source material like myself to be kept on our toes, to not know exactly who's going to die next or what's the next twist and turn, but still all the while remaining in canon. There's 3 different versions of this story, and the writers, Ryan Condal and Miguel Sapochnik, the showrunners, they get to pick and choose. Going to be amazing. Then Ryan had another response to that. He says, yes, it's definitely a challenging adaptation. It's not a straight narrative. So the challenge in it is to pull the material that you need out of it, but also then invent the made-up narrative that stitches this history together. Bro's a genius, right? Ryan Condal. I'm super excited, bro. It's like if I was show running the show myself, right? Super fan. He goes on to say, but I think it also gives you a lot of latitude and freedom as a writer. It's really interesting because you can really serve the adaptation, be extremely faithful to it, but still bring a lot of invention to it just because of the way the story is told. So he kind of reiterates what I just mentioned. And then another talking point that I want to discuss in this video is Idris Elba says, which one of y'all who agonizes over the dialogue? Ryan Condal says, that's me because I don't want George to hate me if I get it wrong. George R. Martin says, well, this was an adaptation. He says, well, if this was an adaptation of a novel, then I would just want the dialogue reproduced. But this is a history book adaptation. And in a lot of places, there is no dialogue. So George is kind of saying, you know, like he allows that creative freedom to Ryan. Before on the main series, he wanted it basically a scene-for-scene remake. They obviously didn't do that towards the later seasons, but that's the way that George wants it. So if you ever find yourself questioning and wondering if George didn't like the final seasons, well, he's kind of telling you right there. He's saying, I want my dialogue from my books to be recreated on screen. Maybe spiced up a little bit, maybe they add in a little bit, but don't fucking just completely change it or leave it out, right? Idris Elba then asks, who disagrees with the stakeholders' feedback the most? Ryan Condal says, well, that's George. George R. Martin says, probably. And Ryan Condal, this is funny, says, I haven't sold 100 million books yet in my career, so I have to do a lot more agreeing. They're basically saying, like, when HBO execs come in and say, hey, don't show this person getting brutally murdered. Instead, show this rape scene where these titties are jiggling, right? Ryan has to be like, okay. But George could be like, well, technically, those titties didn't jiggle yet. That person was murdered first. That's kind of what he's talking about. But the next question is, who disagrees, this is asked by Sabrina, Idris Elba's wife, and she says, who is the more cynical writer? And this is a really funny response from George because he's kind of lying. He says, I don't know. Probably me, I guess. I don't like to think of myself as cynical. Yeah, well, the baddies don't like to think of themselves as the baddies. Ah, man. Okay. And then Ryan Condal says, yeah, I think we're pretty sunny, optimistic guys. Yeah, Ryan Condal is, but George is one of the most sadistic people. He's so creative and a genius, too. Idris says, who cares about fans the most? And this will be one of the last talking points that I mentioned for this interview with Ryan Condal, George R. Martin, Idris Elba, and his wife Sabrina Elba on House of the Dragon. The question is, asked by Idris, who cares about fans the most? Ryan Condal said, I think I do at this moment. I think it has to be me because George already has his fans. The fans of the books are numerous and strong. It's our job, Miguel and I, to create a fitting successor show that keeps them happy. George R. Martin's response to that is, I talked earlier about the relationship in comic fandom and science fiction fandom. I love the fans, but I do think Twitter and Instagram and social media has brought out a viciousness I never saw in the old days. The love and hate are very close, particularly with stuff like comic books or any established franchise. I think you could probably speak to this controversy as James Bond, referring to Idris Elba being cast as the first black man playing James Bond. This is going on for you and also before that, The Dark Tower. I suspect Stephen King's fans were vocal about that. So when Idris had a role in The Dark Tower, I'm not familiar with those books at all, but there's a couple things that I want to comment on from those statements. I agree with Ryan Condal. He has to care about the fan base and the audience and critical reception the most because he's literally just entering this world. Like, yes, they finished filming the first season. Yes, he's an established showrunner, and even if this series gets canceled and they don't have another season 2 or whatever, he still is in the Game of Thrones fandom and could still take part in other things. But he's right. He has to care about new fans of this series the most. But George, it's kind of funny. He's saying that people who love his books also hate his books, right? Is that what you're mentioning? Because love and hate are very close, right? Like, I don't think so, man. I think people who love your books love them, but they're also tired of waiting because, let's be honest, it's been so long since the last book came out. Like, that's fine. Take your time, bro. Do whatever the fuck you want. You don't owe people shit. You are an old man. You could literally die shitting on the toilet, and that's fine if it makes you happy, right? But to say that Twitter is the reason why, and Instagram and social media is the reason why you're seeing a viciousness you never saw in the old days, that's where I think you're lying, man. That's where I think you're lying. Like, yes, obviously Twitter, Instagram, and social media allow more people to spew more hate, but you never got this much hate because it's never taken this long to release the next book in the series, man. Like, stop lying to me, Georgie. Like, I love your fucking work. I'm not even that mad that the book hasn't come out. Like, yes, I want to read the shit, but also I'm not going to fucking hate you as a person because you haven't released a book that you don't owe nobody, right? But to say that that's the reason why you're getting so much hate is silly. No, it's because it's never taken this long to get the next book for your series. Now, the last talking point that I want to mention, and this is really funny, George actually says, or Idris Elba actually says, Winds of Winter, the 6th book is late. Wait, no, I'm sorry. This is the second part from what George was saying. He says, Winds of Winter, the 6th book is late. I can get 100 good comments, but there's going to be a few fans out there that are going to remind me on my blog or whatever when I say, Happy Thanksgiving, and they say, never mind, Happy Thanksgiving, where's the book? And I kind of agree with that. Like, if he's talking about his friend passing and he's just making a post about it because this person had a huge influence on his life and he just wants to just make a in memoriam post and there's 1,000 comments saying, where's the fuck is Wins? That's a little bit annoying because honestly, you could click on those accounts and see that they don't follow any of the other Song of Ice and Fire people in the fandom at all. They don't really even follow George. They're just there to get likes, and there might even be bots or whatever saying where's Winds of Winter. So I kind of agree with that part, but don't think that you're getting all this hate because of social media. You're getting all this hate because you haven't released the goddamn book yet. But Condal goes on to say that I just want to say I'm very sorry for that Thanksgiving post, George. I'm just a big fan and really want to read the book. So it sounds like Condal's on our side in that sense. But continuing on here. All right, now one of the last things I wanted to mention for this video is like a brief 30-second or so clip of George R. Martin himself being interviewed by an online magazine, and he's asked about the Rings of Power and how there's a competition between them. Now, it's really kind of funny because George says if one show does good, that probably means even more success or equal amount of success for the other show. They're both fantasy series. They're both some of the highest selling fantasy books of all times. So if one of them does well, it's going to do nothing but promote the other one. But he does kind of take a shot at Rings of Power by saying, Amazon, you didn't even get the books. You didn't get Lord of the Rings. You didn't get The Hobbit. You didn't get the Silmarillion. You didn't get none of those. You got the appendices. And he's like, there's a bunch of history and lore for that time, and you're going to create a show on the Second Age. But you didn't even get the books, right? So he's kind of like talking shit. He basically says that if they win 6 Emmys, I hope we win 7. So it's kind of funny. We all knew that there's like this make-believe rivalry. I'm going to personally be covering both shows. I grew up watching the Lord of the Rings movie over and over again, so there's no reason for me to not try to enjoy that show. If it's bad, then it's bad, and I'll talk about it in my videos. Same with House of the Dragon. If House of the Dragon is bad, I plan on discussing my opinion about that on this channel. That's like my responsibility to you all. I want to thank you all so much for watching. Super special shout out to these individuals as they're the ones who really make these videos possible. And also super special shout out to you watching this video. My name's Mark, and this has been Sorensen. Alonat. Zantrizas busdari ixos. Daur.